The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. I'm April Allen, PeaceHealth System Director of Internal Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I'd like to welcome all community members and PeaceHealth caregivers joining us today as we celebrate the life and legacy of the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King's life work continues to impact and transform the world we live in today. As we reflect on his many contributions, I'm inspired by his profound words. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? Dr. King's message resonates deeply with PeaceHealth's mission and values, which are rooted in standing for social justice and caring for others. Which is why I'm so excited to be joined by Dr. Alisha Moreland-Capuia, as I like to call her, Dr. AMC. She's given me that permission, a globally recognized expert in trauma-informed systems change, who was born and raised in Portland, Oregon. She is the founder and director of McLean Hospital's Institute for Trauma-Informed Systems Change, assistant professor at Harvard Medical School. It keeps going, everyone. And an incredible author who in 2019 wrote Training for Change, Transforming Systems to be Trauma-Informed, Culturally Responsive, and Neuroscientifically Focused, and followed up with her second book, Trauma of Racism, Exploring the People and Systems Fear Built, which is an excellent read. Today, our conversation will focus on shifting priorities to create the beloved community. During the hour or so, we'll discuss healthcare inequalities and how health systems can be trauma-informed and culturally responsive with change, and how we can all play a role in building the beloved community by providing equitable and inclusive care. Throughout our time, you will be able to engage in your own beloved community by asking questions and putting them in the chat. We will get to them by the end of our time together with Dr. AMC. So I am so excited to have you today, Dr. AMC. Greetings. Thank you so much for joining us, and happy MLK Day.
Thank you so very much, April, for that introduction. Thank you to all 242 folks that we have joining us today. So excited to engage and to be here.
Yay, I'm so happy to have you. You are definitely one of my favorite people, new favorite people, as we have been getting to know each other in the last few weeks. And as I mentioned before, your reputation precedes you. Look at that bio. I'd love for our audience to know you too. Tell us a bit more about yourself. And I'm sure the audience might be curious too, what is trauma-informed and culturally responsive systems change? So you break that down a little slowly for some of us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also before I engage, my grandmother taught me properly to say thank you. I'd like to thank PeaceHealth, the leadership there, Zanelle, Heather, I don't want to miss anyone, Jacqueline, you have an amazing team, Natalie, there are a number of folks who work to make this happen, and it is not lost on me, the time and energy, so many thanks. Yeah, when I think about the title, beloved community, there's so much. So I'm going to actually start with the conclusion, and then hopefully through the course of our conversation, we'll work through that. The conclusion is that a beloved community is indeed a trauma-informed community. Well, what do I mean by that? Dr. Peter Levine, who is one of my colleagues sort of in the trauma arena, says this about trauma. He says that trauma is perhaps the most avoided, ignored, belittled, denied, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering. And so it occurs to me that as we have this conversation today, April, about a beloved community, that we cannot talk about the development of a beloved community in the absence of exploring the very tenuous, complicated, complex, and nuanced relationship between love and suffering. And the other piece is the fact that trauma, if we look at the data, and it serves out worldwide, actually. If you look at World Health Organization data, if you look at the data from the CDC, which I know some folks have issues with that, but this is legitimate data because it's coming directly from the states. What the data bears out is that at least 60% of our colleagues, friends, sisters, brothers have or will endorse at least one adverse childhood experience. And that stat, that basically traverses race, class, socioeconomic status. So what that suggests to me, and the reason I want to put that out here as we set the framework for what does it mean to be trauma informed, is that trauma is everybody's business. It means that trauma shows up every single place. Wherever there are human beings, there too is suffering and trauma. It means that it's ubiquitous. And because trauma is everybody's business, every system has to be in the business of working to recognize, acknowledge, and prevent needless suffering and further re-traumatization. So just a little more, and I want to pause. I'll take a beat and pause for the cause to ensure that we can go back and forth and check for understanding. There are multiple ways and means and modes that can lead to trauma. Natural disasters, COVID, right? Loss, childhood trauma, racism, discrimination. However, what we understand, in the areas in which I research and have the privilege and blessing to be able to work in, is that the way that trauma impacts individuals and systems and society physiologically and neurobiologically is similar. And that is, it is akin to a stress response. And so to be traumatized is to be wounded, is to be stressed. We are not designed as human beings to be under any amounts of chronic stress, because there are implications. And those implications are that eventually the long-term sequelae is that we break down, that immunity is lowered, that inflammation happens, that we are more prone to disease states, that we are not able to fully live out our call, right, to help co-create a beloved community. And then lastly, I'll say is that when we are trauma informed, you look at any of the literature, especially SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health and Services Administration. I don't want to alphabet soup here. SAMHSA outlined very specifically what the basic tenets, and it's just a framework. The framework for being trauma informed is very clear. And I've said this well before. I've been in the business now for 17 years, the business of helping to prevent needless suffering, because I believe that's the call of every human being, right? Right? It's not that we won't suffer, but that we get to a place where we learn to suffer well. And I'll address that at some point too. The last thing for sure, in the trauma-informed care framework, it essentially talks about things like voice and choice, empowerment, collaboration, right? The ability to recognize, acknowledge, and manage trauma. So you can't ignore it, right? But then also, interestingly enough, it's the piece that often gets ignored in the model is race, is gender, cultural, and historical, and gender considerations. That's the piece that often gets. So what I'll say to resolve this is that you cannot be an anti-racist organization or an organization that says that you are for justice. The absence of a trauma-informed, a very profoundly robust and fortified trauma-informed foundation. I'll pause for the cause and see if there's follow-up or additional points of clarification required at this time.
Well, no, I think you broke it all the way down there, Dr. AMC. I do think what you said about suffering well. I'm looking forward to you expounding on that more. And I've heard you talk about our systems. And I would really, really like you to speak to that a little bit more, because sometimes, first of all, this is open to other communities as well. So we're happy to have them. But sometimes systems is such a healthcare nomenclature that it will alienate other folks who are like, well, what are they saying system? So if we just talk about systems and what a culturally responsive system looks like, I'd love you to speak to that more. And I know you can do this as well as breaking it down for our audience so that they can understand it in a way that is digestible for them, because that's what you're great at, Dr. AMC.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. When we talk about system, I'm talking about literally the most foundational system is family and community. But we are also talking about education. We're talking about criminal justice. We're talking about the workplace. We are talking about healthcare. We're talking about all of it. Any place essentially where human beings function and operate and are working members to provide a service or to support the service and in service of others. That's a system. And so means literally everything and everybody, literally. And so this idea of cultural responsivity is very, it actually is very clear. There's a number, there are two things. One, the first sort of seminal study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which is a seminal study because it was done, one of the earlier ones by Kaiser, and Felita and Anda led that work. But there was very quickly a keen recognition that the initial sort of things that went into that original ACE survey, or that they evaluated. So for instance, it was things like, the initial was, did you not have enough to eat? It was about basic needs not being met. Also about, were your parents divorced? Did you ever have to go to school dirty? Did you ever, physical and in all forms of abuse? Did you have someone in your family with a mental health struggle, or entangled with the law? And here's what was interesting. That was a very important piece. But what was recognized very early on is that it did not consider other psychosocial stressors like racism, like neighborhood, like the structural impacts of the things around folks that sort of led folks to be in a particular condition. So shortly thereafter, you had the Philadelphia Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And this Philadelphia ACEs does consider and did bring into consideration the historical aspects of trauma and how racism contributes to stress. And so essentially what we get when you look at both, and I would say that the original ACE and the Philadelphia Adverse Childhood Experience Study are both seminal studies in that regard. So when we talk about, again, and when we're talking about being trauma informed, you can't really talk about a trauma informed environment in which it calls and mandates us to prevent the re-traumatization, to tend to the suffering of others, to reduce needless suffering. We can't talk about being trauma informed without talking about being culturally responsive and moving away from the things that cause folks to be harmed, to feel harmed, or to feel unsafe. So that really is the basic sort of tenet of that. Systems change, we're talking about helping equip systems with the tools that they need to create the conditions for belonging and to prevent needless suffering.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I want to back up just a little bit. Tell us a little bit more about yourself, because I find your story incredibly compelling, and I could relate to it, to be honest, as a little African-American girl growing up also in the Pacific Northwest, and grew up in Vancouver, Washington, but spent a lot of my time in Portland, Oregon with my cousins and grandma, because they too have the house in Northeast Portland before gentrification hit. And so I would just like the audience to know a little bit more about you, and how you, although you're right now in Boston, but how you really connect to the Pacific Northwest and how that has helped guide some of your work.
Absolutely. So basically, as you indicated at the outset, that's I refer to Oregon as she, that's just my personal connection. She is beautiful and complicated at the same time. And I was born there and raised, as you said and indicated, and spent my whole entire education there, was publicly educated, went to Sacagawea Head Start, went to King Elementary, went to Tubman Middle School, and graduated from Jefferson High School, actually. And my connections and roots run deep. My family came there in the 40s, late 30s, early 40s. They came up from the South during that period of time of what we could consider the Great Migration, if you will. And they found jobs at the shipyards and at ESCO. And we firmly planted ourselves there and made a contribution. They are lawyers, they are businessmen and women, they are blue collar workers, but we are there. It's a large family, the Warren family. And my grandfather, Papa Herbert, had a very keen sense of expectation that we would move forward. My great aunts were in the South at one point, had picked cotton, and so they came looking for a different life. It was very clear to me, and we were raised in the church. So for me, it's difficult to disconnect my personal story from the work that I do. So it's no surprise that I'm in a position where my goal in life is to serve others, to do good, and to reduce human suffering. It's all a part of an extensive mission. And so this concept of beloved community in MLK is not one that is it's not a new concept. It is part of the core of who I am. and wish to be.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I'm nodding my head in agreement because we have similar backgrounds. My family came up in the early 30s. My grandfather came up in the early 30s. He came up from Texas, was in the war, came up and said, you know what, there's opportunity in the shipyard, came in, brought my grandmother up. She cleaned trains for a living down at the train station in Portland, and soon brought my father up, who was living with my great grandparents at the time, and he was there, and he had told me stories. My father recently passed, but would tell me stories about picking cotton as a little boy and going, what is happening? Like, he just was confused by the whole thing, he said, frankly. So I definitely, your story resonates with me about the complexity of the relationship with Oregon, right? Because Oregon and Washington, it has a beauty. I call it a beautiful. I'm trying to use my words appropriately, but a beautiful mess when you are African American or a person of color at times, because you see the beauty in this state or these states, but you also see where you don't have a voice or where you're not represented. And it can be challenging. It can be challenging as a mom. It can be challenging as an employee. It can be challenging just being who you are and trying to create that beloved community. So I will switch over to that. This year's theme for the Martin Luther King Jr. Day is shifting priorities to create a beloved community. It's the vision Dr. King had for us to create an equitable and inclusive community. Do you believe we've achieved this vision? And if so, how?
Yeah, another important, I think, connection to be made here. Again, I started by saying I was going to give you the punchline that a beloved community is a trauma-informed community. So I want to, if I could be so bold as to unpack that a little bit.
Yes, please.
I believe that we are evolving, and I believe that we are hopefully we are still perfectly committed to co-constructing this beloved community, but it's going to take the work of all of us. As I was reflecting on this question, April, I couldn't help but think about where the phrase beloved community really sort of where it stemmed from. You know, MLK used this phrase in a 1957 speech entitled "The Birth of a New Nation." And I found it interesting because it wasn't, and I say he popularized the term, but the term actually was used by a theologian philosopher by the name of Josiah Royce well before. But in this speech where King is talking about the birth of a new nation, where it comes up is in this quote, he says, "The aftermath of nonviolence is the creation of beloved community." And I think it's relevant for where we are right now geopolitically. But then there's more. It wasn't just there's the creation of this beloved community. It's sort of like it's described in this quote as beauty for ashes, if you will, right? But then he goes further to say that the aftermath of nonviolence is redemption, and that the aftermath of nonviolence is reconciliation. Right. So and then resolves that line by saying, moves away from nonviolence and saying, but the aftermath of violence is emptiness and bitterness. So I had to go back through and I was thinking about why, you know, MLK very early on would use this phrase beloved community as a goal, as an objective, as something that we could all work towards. And it's not hard to understand when we sort of, again, understand this relationship between love and suffering. Right? The word be, you know, is a prefix. It sort of enhances the root word in this case, be loved, right? And like I said, there's always been this very complicated and nuanced relationship between love and suffering. And again, because I was raised in a Baptist church, and I'm not, and you know, I am who I am. I love folks. There's things that I don't agree with, right? I wrestle with that as well. However, if we get to a point whether we see the Bible as a historical document and text, or even it's a part of a faith, it's interesting when we look at this sort of relationship between love and suffering. It's age old, right? If you believe it or not, right? That God sent his son to go to a cross, which is this ultimate act of love, to die and suffer for the salvation of others, which again, I think is a very interesting concept, that we're talking about love and the demonstration of love is about suffering. And at the point of suffering, though, again, just going back to it as a historical text, you see Jesus at the Garden of Gethsemane, which is right at the foot of the Mount of Olives. And there are a few questions that he asks as he contemplates his future suffering on the cross. He asks at that point, Father.
Yes. You're talking to a pastor's kid.
If you are willing, hold on. He says, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup, right, of divine wrath from me. But then it resolves that by saying, but yet not my will, but your will be done. And so what we see here is a demonstration, right, of love, right? The demonstration and the fact is that love has never been easy, ever, but it is the call in a beloved community. And then further, let's get beyond the biblical text, which I just wanted to demonstrate that this complicated relationship between love and suffering is age-old. The BBC, there was a writer, I don't know if you know him, Benjamin Ram. Are you familiar with him?
Yes, I am.
Benjamin Ram writes this piece, I think about 3 years ago, this eloquent piece, and he outlines for us what King, Kennedy, and Obama had in common in terms of the greatness of their speeches. And as Benjamin Ram is outlining this work in the BBC history section, Ram points out that just before King's death, literally just before his death, at the last sermon, that he basically gives a preemptive eulogy. And King says, and I paraphrase, that when I die, I want somebody to say, I tried to love somebody. I mean, I want to underscore and emphasize the word I tried to love somebody. It is a humble yet poignant acknowledgement of the hard work, right? There's just this love is hard.
Yeah.
It's a hard option. But then also it goes on to, in this same article, Ram shares that Kennedy at the time after King's death was in Ohio giving a speech. And he was very poignantly about what he called the mindless menace of violence and in his humanity. And Kennedy also talked about the violence of institutions. He talked about inaction. He talked about slow decay. And then there was this conversation that I think is powerful, that Kennedy also spoke to this alienation that causes us to look at our brothers and sisters as alien. And he says that men and women with whom we share a city, but not a community. Wow. Okay. And then lastly, as Kennedy is resolving this, right, and this is what Ram is masterful in this piece, is that Kennedy and King highlight this truth, that the heart is one, it's not the only, but the heart is one of the most important muscles. And I'm starting to outline for you now, I'm breaking down the elements of a beloved community. Now, we going somewhere with this. This is all intentional. So is one of the.
Tell you, I got a pen because that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write and I'm going to be the student today instead of the professor. Go ahead.
So he says that the heart is one of the most important muscles. And catch this, that the more it loves, the better it becomes at loving. So it again is this recognition that love is the hard but necessary option, right? That we don't get to separate. We're talking about a beloved community. That if we really, really are intentional and serious about our desire to create a beloved community, then we've got to get comfortable with that very important historical and long-standing relationship, love and suffer. So I'll pause because there's more I want to share about it, but I'll pause and just see. Again, I'm just pause for the cause. I'll take a beat because I can go on. I get excited, so I'll just pause.
You definitely have some preachers in your background. So I have questions because I will go preaching too. So this is keeping me on track. No, I think what you're saying is great. Needless suffering. We talk about one of the things I've heard you say over and over in interviews is your job is to stop as much as you can needless suffering. That's all of our call to action. You believe that. And I love how you intertwine suffering well, right? Because love is uncomfortable. And we forget that. Love is an action word. And in that same realm of when Dr. King is talking about the beloved community, he talks about agape love. So if anybody is, familiar with any kind of church vernacular, and you go in and you hear about the different kind of loves, right? And you're smiling because we have a similar experience. If you have gone to church, or particularly, can we say Black church, and they will break down the different loves for you. They will talk about eros, they will talk about philia, and then they will talk about agape, right? And King talks about agape and saying, and he has a quote that I was looking at actually yesterday: agape does not begin by discriminating between worthy and unworthy people. And that's what you're talking about, what you mentioned. It begins by loving others for their sakes, and makes no distinction between a friend and an enemy. It is directed towards both. Agape is love seeking to preserve and create community. That is a love community right there.
There you go. And encased in that, there's so much subtext though, right? Because the goal is, I feel like folks are more likely to move towards, right, when we think about what does it mean? What does our humanity mean? What are my instructions as an individual as I seek to derive meaning from those around me and the experience? I believe that a lot of what we've seen in our world today is a result of folks feeling very empty and disconnected, and quite honestly, flailing and just that complete sense of emptiness and lack of meaning, trying to find meaning in anything. And sometimes that can get dangerous. But I want to get back to this agape love and community, because I really believe, right, we can't just be individuals that live in a place together, or that coexist together, or co-locate in an office setting, or co-locate in a virtual space, yet we don't create community. There has to be, instead of co-location, there has to be some level of bidirectional exchange. And so it brings me to this point. If we think about, since we are talking about MLK, and we are talking about, right, the different forms of love, which you are absolutely spot on with, it also is not lost on me that if you look at just about any sermon that MLK gave, he always talked about, at some point highlighted the real challenges of being human, right? Because folks, he was just soft. It's like, no, I struggle just like you to love. However, I know that is our only way out. But he would refer to it as like giants in the land, very biblical. But he would also talk about the prodigious hilltops, and that every valley shall be exalted and every mountain shall be made low. And that, and there was also this very interesting and repetitive reference to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. We all know that the Battle Hymn of the Republic was penned by an abolitionist woman, yes, in 1861. And her name was Julia Ward Howard. And when she penned this over 160 years ago, not that I'm just going to give just a few lines of the first stanza and the last stanza, because I believe, again, our answer for what a beloved community looks like can be found in the stanza of this battle hymn. Okay. It is, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where what the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning in his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. And then I'm going to switch to the last stanza. It says, in the beauty of the lilies, was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make me holy, catch this, let us die to make men free. But also catch this piece, while God is marching on. So as I thought about this, why would MLK continue to repeat this refrain? Literally, I kid you not, in almost every one of his speeches. And you think about it, grapes of wrath, if you go back the book of Revelation, it talks very specifically about God's justice, that he'll deliver justice, that at some point there'll be a reward, again, for suffering, right? And then this idea that, we think about transfiguration. This blows my mind. To be transfigured means that it's a complete change of form to a more beautiful and spiritual state. And then the last line, like, as he died to make us holy, let us die. It's not literally, but metaphorically, right? Symbolically, to make men free. While that there's a parallel process, a model, an example for what it looks like to move towards justice, to care for those among you, and to symbolically die. The question I would have for our colleagues and friends among us today is symbolically, what has to die in order for freedom to reign in the community in which we are all trying to co-create? What must die? The last thing I want to say, Sister April, because look, they came for it. I want them to get all of it so we can wrestle with it together. The last thing I want to say in this refrain, there are researchers at Harvard Medical School. There are a couple, and I've actually had the privilege of being in grand rounds with them. It's Dr. Richard Schwartz and Jacqueline Oles. They're professors and they study love. Here is what their research has revealed, and I'm just going to keep it real quick because I'm a neuroscientist, so we can't talk about, I want to make sure you get it all. When we think about love, they talk about the early stages of love and the late, more mature love. In the early stages, there's a neurobiological and physiological impact. What is that? Dopamine is high, serotonin is low, and cortisol is high. So basically, early love is stressful. It's stressful. Late love, more mature love, physiologically, neurobiologically, what we find is that oxytocin, which is we connect, is increased. So it speaks to this idea that the more we love, the better we become at loving. It is not an easy process.
It's not.
Requirements in the beloved community.
Yeah.
There it is.
You just said and amen. I'm thinking about our sisters right now who start off on this mission to make sure they loved those in certain communities or in communities here in the Pacific Northwest, and they were provided access to healthcare, those that were being forgotten. And so this helps me move to my next question right there. Dr. King quote that resonated with me and inspires the continued passion and commitment to justice that we have here at PeaceHealth is, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. Dr. King said that.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts there? What are your thoughts with how can we, as an organization, or different organizations, a community, continue to provide equitable and inclusive care that further closes the gap and eliminates healthcare disparities?
I think it's real. I'm gonna speak to the heart of the matter because I'm sure that all 323 folks joining us today have a good understanding of and command on the literature, right?
Yeah.
That and demonstrates the disparities. And at some point, we get beyond what the data continues to demonstrate, and you got to get to, well, what can we do?
Yep.
Here, my core belief in what I've seen in the last 17 years is that when we are in a place where where we understand the call of being a public facing individual or system or community that serves others as we serve one another, because it's not just about serving others, but also as we serve one another.
Yes.
There has to be a higher moral call to prevent needless human suffering. And if we believe in that mission, now there's multiple kinds of suffering. I'm not talking about the inevitable suffering. COVID has been, we have lost 1 million of our brothers, sisters, cousins. I mean, it has been tremendously and profoundly, we are grieving. Okay. There are things that, and okay, I will also put this out there. Some of that could have been prevented. Okay. But that's neither here nor there. However, there are things that will happen in our lives and losses that we cannot necessarily, we don't have any control over. So the real goal is to find a way to peaceably coexist with the reality that life sucks and it's hard, but it is also very beautiful and worth living, right? That's different. What I'm talking about is needless preventable suffering. And because we all have within us, that is within our wheelhouse, it's like, what can we do from where we sit word it very much like this: with the power that we have, both personal, individual, professional, prevent needless suffering. That is the call. And when we do that, because being trauma informed is really the work of understanding suffering and how it shows up and working to prevent it. And I just want to repeat that because it is really as simple as that.
Thank you. Say that one more time. I want you to say it again because you are emphasizing that, and I think people need to hear that because so many people get overwhelmed with, I can't do anything, right? Or I don't know where to start. And my thing is, start somewhere, right?
Wherever you sit.
Yes, wherever you sit, start somewhere. Because the other thing I've noticed with people, they want to be perfect. And one thing you'll hear me say a lot is perfection is the death of progress, right? And I, you know, in my field, I get frustrated when people are like, there's no such thing as perfection, right? I've even told my children that, my girls, because I think society has this fallacious notion that somehow you're going to look perfect, you're going to act perfect, you're going to be perfect. They put that out there knowing you can't be perfect. So why would doing DEI or more inclusive systems be any different? But you try and you start on the journey and you try to keep going, and when you know better, you do better, in the words of Dr. Maya Angelou, right? And you keep going. And so I'm hoping today that we're learning and we're learning how to do better too, right? So thank you for that. One thing you said, and I might be backtracking us just a little bit, but this is for the own personal nerd in me. You talked about fear and trauma.
Yes.
And I've heard you talk about it. And I heard one podcast you did, and the podcast host, who was fabulous, had said something. Aren't all systems inherently racist? So I'm going to go there, everybody. So hold on to your seats for the word that people get concerned when you start saying that. And I said, and you responded so eloquently. You said, let's back it up. You said, let's talk about our systems being steeped in fear.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that a little bit? I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but that was phenomenal.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. I just want folks to know that I can speak to the range of these things. And there's a whole workshop that I give on this. But the brief is, and it's really the basis of my second book, The Trauma of Racism. And it's intentional. The subtitle is Exploring Systems and People. Fear. And I think that there are two questions that oftentimes we don't ask enough that would be helpful. That is, what is the fear and what is the need? There is not one single system in which we operate in. Let's just take, for instance, the minute we start talking about change for any particular system, it is difficult for folks to decouple change with something being wrong or fear automatically being attached to it. And so the work really of change is learning to remove the fear out of the process, to at least acknowledge it. There is fear on multiple levels: fear of what you might lose, fear of what you don't have, fear of rejection, fear of exclusion. So you've got a number in any particular system, you have a number of fear on fear interactions. And neurobiologically, and this is again what I study and help organizations figure out. It is, if we were to actively, thoughtfully survey, and not to, and this is an opportunity for reinforcement. This is an opportunity to reimagine. This is an opportunity to, folks talk about well-being all of the time, but it's like, what does that mean? What does it really mean? And so when you start to dig a little deeper and you check underlying assumptions and you start to look at the organization, you find that there's a lot of fear of so many things for so many reasons, but because no one ever feels comfortable enough having the conversation, we never get to it. So here's a connection. Fear that is unchecked and that does not turn off is one way to think about the neurobiological basis of trauma.
Yes.
And that's a whole nother workshop to check. But what I ask organizations to do is to actively, and this is not also an exercise in the fear industrial complex. It's a reality that fear definitely is operating, and the fact that it goes unchecked means that the organization loses its ability to optimally heal.
Yeah, no, what you're saying, you know, and I'll say this as a non-clinician, right? So when I heard you talk about this, which for me was just oh, as Oprah would say, you have your moment, and you were saying, let's back up, right? Because sometimes people go right into all systems are, inherently racist, especially with the move for anti-racism, et cetera, et cetera. But you said, look, all systems were built,
By, yes. Mm-hmm.
and you said because of fear. And I think what's so interesting to me is because fear is, some people will never admit they're racist or go down the line of the isms, right? But they will say, I am acting this way or I feel this way. They'll never say that, but I love this. I love my country. I love how things have worked in the past. I love my group, right? And how we do things.
Yeah.
So what I've learned with fear is people can dress fear up in fancy clothes, honey.
Oh.
They'll put on some earrings and the best suit and and dress it up in the word love. Instead of really connecting with what I fear is, I'm going to be excluded or left behind, or there's not enough resource for me or people that look like me. If we're going to be honest, right? Something I say, call a thing, right? That's not the best grammar for everybody out there, but this is a colloquial term that is used in certain communities. Call a thing, right? And so sometimes people will say, and it's like, no, is it really your love or is it your fear? And one thing,
but I think that right, and I think that this is where we have to kind of gain an appreciation for the fact that multiple things can be true at the same time. That a loving father can also be racist. That doting boss can also be racist. And I believe what you're referring to is, I give this example of structural racism, and I talk about the center that cannot hold. Mm-hmm. And very important question, because for me, it becomes an issue of abdication of responsibility, which I believe we all have a responsibility. So I ask the question, if I am a part of a racist system, right, a system built by racism, does that make me racist? And I answer the question by saying, well, no, it doesn't. But what does it make me? It makes me responsible to actively think about what I can do from where I sit to thoughtfully, right, to thoughtfully and intentionally deconstruct this very powerful social construct. Right.
Yes. Yes.
And so what that means is that I can't abdicate my responsibility. Right. And then I went into this conversation about sort of Jimmy James Baldwin and when he talks about that responsibility can't be lost. It can only be abdicated. And to the extent that we accept our responsibility in this call, again, underneath that, the subtext is to reduce human suffering, which we all can do.
Yes.
Because racism causes trauma. Racism is a form of preventable human suffering. Let me just be clear. So to the extent we accept our responsibility, then we can begin again. And that's what I believe we are asking for today in the construction of this beloved community, is to begin again.
Yes. No, that's what I wanted you to hit at. And I didn't want to try to usurp your role, because you can say it the way you can say it. But that's the duality of humanness, right? I always say that as I work as a professor as well. And I'm always like, humans, it's the duality. Two things can exist at the same time that are complete opposites. And that's what's always interesting about humans, right? So, okay, thank you for that. Okay, you're making me excited and lose track of time because you are, look, I'm gonna ask one more question and then we're gonna go to the chat and see if there's any questions that you can ask or answer. I'm sorry. I will say this, when you were talking about this, one Dr. King quote that came is, if I cannot do great things, this came to me, I can do small things in a great way, right? I cannot do great things, I can do small things in a great way. So I hope that serves as encouragement to people who do want to help make more culturally responsive and trauma-informed systems, right? And make some changes. Okay, so we'll end here with questions. The last 2 years have been difficult psychologically, physically, spiritually, and geopolitically, which you touched on a little bit for many. Might you speak to the difficulty and potential way forward?
Absolutely. The acknowledgement is that in some way, shape, or form, we are or will be grieving something. And I think that a healthy organization and any trauma-informed organization is a grieving organization. It's a living organization. It's a feeling organization. It's human. And essentially the way forward really is we've got a roadmap, right? So it becomes, I always like to remind us of the things. So history should be our best teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And there are things that folks think they're recreating the wheel. We don't even have to duplicate effort. We have a very clear roadmap for what a beloved community looks like and what love is. And so I will round out this conversation with this, that it turns out that I want to go back to love, because again, it's not this easy thing, but it is the call, and it undergirds love, undergirds trauma-informed efforts. It has to. And so I go back to my roots that have not failed me yet. And there is a passage, and it turns out that love across faiths, there's a universality in the understanding of what it is. So it is, love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others. And I'll skip toward the end. It says it always protects, it always trusts, it always perseveres. Love never fails. So at the end, I've tried to have this conversation with us today, and April, you have been incredible to really make sure that I could fill out the basics, premise. If my basic sort of what I wanted to submit to you today, that a trauma-informed community is really a beloved community, then it contains these elements. When you look at love in Buddhism, it teaches unconditional love, and that understanding is love's other name. When you look at Hinduism, love is a sacrament, and it is this idea that it's selfless and you don't expect anything in return. And in Islam, it says that without divine love, there can be no human love. So to conclude, when we think about what a beloved community is and what we're asking, it is a community where each of us is called to be love and consider ourselves beloved, because beloved is both a noun and an adjective.
Yeah.
Right. It's a place where we create lives worth living as we co-create communities that are worth building and maintaining. And it's a community where each of us takes stake in the well-being of those around us, right? And that my healing is inextricably linked to yours, right? That basic needs are met. It is a place where we understand that the more we love, the better we become at loving. And ultimately, a beloved community is indeed a trauma-informed community where we are conscious of the suffering of others. And we are, and racism is a form of preventable, needless suffering.
Yeah.
We commit ourselves to preventing needless suffering. And the last thing is, the symbolism is not lost on me. As a beloved community, and going back to the battle hymn, what are we willing to symbolically die for? To community that we all deserve.
Yeah, I love that. I'm giving you a hand clap. I know others are. We have some questions, so we have some good questions, but I love what you just said about love. I could say one of the things my father taught me as a little girl, he would say often, love is sacrifice. Love is giving up the right to be right. And so, and people don't always understand that, but even if we look at the biblical text, it's right there in real life demonstration. It's demonstrated for us. So yes, so don't say we love unless we love, is all I'm saying.
Love is work. Love is work.
My grandma would say, don't say it unless you mean it.
Unless you mean it. Love is work, and love never fails.
Yes. It never fails, and love drives away fear.
Yes.
So, but we won't go to church today. We're gonna get to these questions, right? Okay, how do we as an organization meet people at the point of their trauma/suffering and wrap them in love when we sometimes just get caught up in our daily task and ignore what may be happening around us?
Sure, it's a good question. And I say this all the time, and I'll go on record saying this again today, that even in these virtual spaces, it's interesting to me because there's a whole nother level of awareness, right? Because we're mostly in virtual spaces now, or some type of hybrid. If you and I are talking in person, I don't really have to be looking at me as I'm looking at you. But in virtual spaces, it poses both a unique opportunity, but also a challenge, because there's a heightened level of awareness that I'm paying attention, I'm conscious of you, I'm looking at you as I'm looking at me, right? And so it causes me to have to, in some ways, be a little bit more aware. Mm-hmm. And so there's an opportunity in these virtual spaces, and even in the communities, and when we eventually go back to work, where we pause for the cause and we take a moment and we absolutely see people for where we see them and we acknowledge. So there's an acknowledgement of folks' presence. I cannot begin to tell you how many folks tell me, I go into my office or we got into the Zoom meeting and we hopped right into business. Nobody even said, hey, how you doing? How was your night? Are you okay? We didn't even pause for a moment of mindfulness. So it strikes me as an opportunity. There's an opportunity, very, very easy things to do, to pause, to let folks know. I always do a roll call, and I know folks, they think it's funny, but I'm like, I see you, April, I see you. I call out everybody's name, I see you, because it turns out that when people feel valued and seen, that they feel connected. And that's what a part of beloved trauma-informed community is. It's about appreciating that there's not that we're codependent, dependent, or independent, that we're interdependent. That is a human need. Yeah. And see folks. And so the last piece to that is, and I would pose this question to whoever asked that really great question: when was the last time you had a conversation with anybody, or anybody ever asked you, what do you need in order to feel safe to do your job? It's a key question that most organizations don't have. Folks are afraid to have these conversations about safety, but it is incredibly important. More, if you want to know more, we have workshops 2 days. Come see us.
That was awesome, and that was good. I will hone in on people need to be seen. One term I've coined when I do consulting or I work with executives and coaching is, I have this term I call RPV. Some people here at PeaceHealth has heard me say it. People want to feel respected, protected, and valued. If you can manage that, you reduce turnover. You just create an atmosphere where people are joyful and happy. Yes, things are coming, life is hard, work is hard. Our frontline workers, God bless them, and my hat off to them. But if an organization can do their part with that RPV, I call it respected, protected, and valued, you have somebody who will stick with you for the long term. I also want to say one thing PeaceHealth does really well is we have a time for reflection before we jump in. And in coming to this organization, that was one of the things that meant a lot to me, just taking a minute and stopping and centering myself and centering my wellness and saying, okay, you know what? There's more to life than my task, right? So and that's just me. Obviously, I'm not in the clinician part, so it's a little bit different, but yeah. Okay, let me get to my next question. We have a lot, so I'm not gonna give any more commentary. I'm gonna be quiet. I'm gonna act like I'm in the corner. What are some of the elements of robust trauma-informed practice that you would recommend for an organization?
Yeah, so very quickly, because I'll try to also be a little bit pithy in my replies. So the basic tenets, safety first. You have to assess for safety, and I don't need to assume what folks need to be safe. I just encourage you to ask. Voice and choice, it really is very important for folks to feel a sense of agency and like they belong. It turns out that there's very strong science on rejection, and when folks feel rejected, it is literally painful, and there's a whole neuroscience in it. The other piece is a complete and absolute respect. We can't say that we honor diversity, inclusion, and equity and belonging if the minute someone disagrees with us or there's dissent, that we shut down or we shut a conversation down instead of finding ways to work our way through the conflict. We get better as we have different views and opinions. And if we honestly believe that the strength of any organization, people, society, or world is based on our diversity, there has to be a complete and open respect. There's also a level of vulnerability and humility. I'll be quick in a minute to say to some folk, if I mess something up, I missed the mark, and let's do better. There's nothing worse than being arrogant. So I remain perpetually curious. I remain unwavering in my humility. And just a few things, but there are some basic tenets, and there are specific things, and to assess belonging. Right, there's a belonging exercise that I usually give to folks and to organizations, and they do with their respective programs, departments, to see what is required. So I'll stop there, but those are just to start.
No, I think that was awesome, and those were good practical, points that sometimes we miss, and we want something. What does that look like in practice versus in theory? And I think you answered that. The next question I'm seeing is about respect, because we have a value of respect here. And sometimes and it says, what does that practically look like when we are living in such complex times with such diversity of thought and opinion? How can our value of respect practically help create that beloved community? Something I've heard you say before is you ask questions. What do you mean by that? And that's something that I echo, because that's what I tell people to do. Ask a question. What does that mean? Why? Why do you think that? Confrontation doesn't have to be cantankerous. It
Correct.
doesn't have to be violent. It just means, what does that mean? So we can both get a better understanding of what you're saying, and how I'm hearing it may not be aligned. But go ahead if you have anything to add to that.
Absolutely. Again, this is the piece where I think that any good leader, any good person in a trauma-informed space is both teacher and learner, and understands when to exercise the wisdom to be one or the other. So that means that at any given point, I am learning and I'm in a listening mode. I am also known for saying, and I honestly believe it, that listening is a form of love, and it's a way for us to demonstrate our ability to, it's an easy thing to do, and then to reflect back. But more important over listening is a form of love. Am I listening to respond, or am I listening to understand? And I think that's an opportunity to even make shifts in how we listen.
Yeah.
There's so much more to say, but I know we're running out of time. I don't want to.
Yeah, I love that. I want to get this one question in, because I think it is what a takeaway people can take. But I love what you just said. Listen, as James said, be slow to speak.
Yep.
And quick to listen. And that's what I try to practice, because I have a lot of words. So I have to go. Don't just listen. So, okay, can you share an example of what reducing preventable suffering would look like? Meaning, if we all walked away today with an action item to work on, what can we do or stop doing in order to reduce the preventable suffering?
Absolutely. So I think I'll repeat this. There's an opportunity. I don't think we have enough discussions about safety and what we require. I believe it is really a trauma-informed organization is a feeling organization, right? So it is to ask each of the members of your beloved community what they need in order to feel safe, in order to do their job, and then work to demonstrate that you've listened. You actually will get quite a bit of information. It's a wonderful exercise. It's one of many, but that's the first place that I would encourage you to start, because any trauma-informed organization has to be a safe organization.
Yeah. Well, I am going to stop there, because I just got to know we have a lot more questions, and we do have more questions, and we cannot. So what we'll do is we'll have those questions submitted, and we'll follow up with them separately. If you're okay with that, Dr. AMC, we would love to get you to weigh in. Yes. You are incredible. You are dynamic. And I thank you for your time. If you have any final words of encouragement, wisdom, and hope you can offer, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Absolutely. I think I've said, I know I get 3 closes, but I'll stick with I just say that thank you again to you, April, and your commitment to establishing this beloved community in a trauma-informed, culturally responsive space. And if folks and organizations, again, want to explore this deeply, our institute, the Institute at McLean Hospital's Institute for Trauma-Informed Systems Change, actually offers monthly 2-day workshops. And these workshops are quite powerful, because it allows you the safety of space to explore. You come out with, you get a lot of good learning, but there are case studies, and you come out with some very tangible things that you can do. I believe that where we increase understanding, we increase the probability of change. When folks know what they can do, that they oftentimes are willing to do it. So again, thanks to many of you, and in April, again, many thanks to you and the leadership team there, as you all endeavor to co-labor in your shared commitment to create a beloved trauma-informed community.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for all of those who have joined today, and all those who will watch later. Have a good day, and know that you are loved. I always like to leave with that because people need to know they're seen and they are loved. So yeah, thank you so much and have a great day. Thank you, Dr. MC.
Absolutely. Thank you. Be well, everyone.